Welcome to the Global Series interview on hydrogen, where we slice through the buzz of what's next for the most abundant natural element in the universe and ask what tangible steps can be made in 2021 and beyond. Very happy to introduce 𝗛𝗆𝗿𝗍𝗔. He is the Associate Program Officer for Hydrogen at IRENA, also known as the International Renewable Energy Agency. 𝗛𝗆𝗿, hi.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Let's kick off with some broader strokes. Building a hydrogen economy will require approximately $280 billion of course, these forecasts, in investments by 2030, according to the Hydrogen Council. Do you think that is a viable sum to be raised in the economic environment at the moment, especially considering, arguably, according to the IMF, we're in the worst economic state since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The IEA is already saying it's going to cost $1 trillion for the energy transition for the next 3 years alone. Other estimates put it at 40 trillion by 2050. And then, of course, that's cheaper than the cost of not mitigating climate change,
of course,
not just financially, but environmentally and socially and so on. But still, within that picture, which is rather strained, how does the growth of a hydrogen economy, and of course, getting to that level of cost competitiveness with other renewable sources, how does that play out, do you think?
So I think that the amount of $280 billion in 10 years foreseen by the Hydrogen Council makes sense. While the right number, it's impossible to state, it's within the boundaries of recent IRENA analysis that was already conducted last year across the entire energy sector. And indeed, IRENA pointed out that by 2030, we would have needed around 200 billions and 600 billions for 2050. But that was only for the to achieve the 2-degree scenario. Now, if we want to be true to the new challenge that we realized recently of the 1.5 scenario, this amount will be this scenario will require much more investments. So this number makes sense, and it could be much higher, reaching 2050. One thing to consider is that this amount, that obviously it seems a lot, it's not that a lot. If you look about how much money we spend in the energy sector, considering fossil fuels and everything else, every year, around 2 trillions, 1.722 trillions a year. Now, probably 2020 will be an outlier, but still, it's a sizable amount of money. And that on top of that, we have the changes that is already happening. The energy transition, only considering renewable energy, required $300 billion on average in the last 5 years. This was calculated by the IRENA recently in the Finance Landscape, a publication that I suggest everyone to have a look at because it's very detailed with a lot of information. And so this amount of money is reasonable, is within the boundaries of the energy transition. And yes, would you say that, does it make sense also considering what we are going to get back? Of course, the energy transition makes economic sense. This is something we tried to say multiple times. We assessed it, and we realized that for every extra dollars we pay for the energy transition, we are going to get back 3 to 8. So it's quite, I mean, of course, globally, and possibly even in a more distributed way than the current paradigm, which is a pretty fine deal for people.
Absolutely. I wish our personal finances were like that.
Yes, exactly.
Imagine.
The usual story was that renewable energy was costing too much. And now renewable energy is costing less and less. And with the wonderful advantage of not having lung tumor or any of the climate change effects. So I would dare to say that it makes economic sense to spend this. It's around $20 trillion to be spent only to achieve the 2-degree scenarios on top of what we usually spend. But if it's going to give us back around $140 trillion in avoided externalities, I would dare to say that I will do it. moreover, we are going to be remembered as the generation that tried to put a price tag to the future. Let's try to be a little less picky in how much money we are spending to save our planet, because I dare to say that since there is no planet B, we can invest as much money as needed.
Absolutely, there certainly is no plan B. Would you describe the silver bullet narrative that seems to be emerging around hydrogen, especially green hydrogen in the Middle East and beyond in the last year and 18 months? Would you describe that as fair, or do you think that while hydrogen is a very valid market as a standalone market, but some argue, you know, it will count for that last 10% push with certain energy types, do you think that there is a risk that it's going to be detracting attention and monies from other renewable sources? The reason I ask this is because some of the conversations we've been having with industrial shippers, their concerns that their colleagues are using hydrogen and the hype of hydrogen as a distraction instead of greening their industry. Of course, many shippers have done huge work, so IMO 2020 and otherwise as well, but there is this concern. Do you think that's valid?
I think that as a concern is always valid to avoid to lock in consumers or end users in general to any technology that is not good to achieve to surpass the climate change challenge. So yes, waiting for a silver bullet, the technology that will save us, it's always dangerous. And I think I think that what you said about the narrative is very important. In the last year, we had, in the energy sector, we had two topics, COVID-19 and hydrogen. And with multiple strategies, companies announcing that they were moving to hydrogen, and announcements in particular of gigafactories of manufacturers of electrolyzers. But if we want to pinpoint when the hydrogen hype started, I dare to say that it started with the IPCC 1.5 report, 1.5 degrees report. In that moment, the world realized that we had to do the extra mile and achieve the 1.5 degrees. So if hydrogen is to fill the gap in between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, that's the realm where it should stay. And that's where we should focus our efforts first. Of course, creating a larger demand for hydrogen for some applications where direct electrification, renewable energy, bioenergy, energy efficiency already can play a role, could increase the demand of hydrogen and ameliorate the overall business case. But we should be very wary not to take out space for these technologies that are already ready, are cheap, are available, are very much accepted by the population, and they can assist us in achieving the 2 degrees within the time frame that we have. So yes, as Franz Tisserman say, hydrogen is not a silver bullet. We have not to imagine the world going on hydrogen because it's a thermodynamical scene. We have better solutions, it makes more sense, and hydrogen instead, green hydrogen, is a solution for specific application, feedstocks, shipping, aviation, industry in general.
The harder to reach areas, as it were. With hydrogen, you just touched on hydrogen specifically as well. In terms of its cost competitiveness and affordability by, say, 2030 seems to be the current estimates. And there have been very public statements being made by leaders in the Middle East and other countries as well, saying really hydrogen is going to be central to our energy economy going forward. Do you see these relatively recent statements, I mean, they're only in the last month or so, do you see these recent statements as accelerating that timeline, or is 2030s as soon as it can possibly be?
Oh, that's a very good question. I believe that 2030 is a reasonable time frame. IRENA recently published a report about it, about the cost compression of hydrogen, where my colleagues identified those areas that will make possible for hydrogen to become competitive with the so-called blue, that for whoever does not know yet, is usual hydrogen plus CCS. So yes, by 2030, with the right investment, right pace, we can achieve a green hydrogen cost that is within the boundaries of blue, if not gray, if not below, for this hydrogen, for this shade of hydrogen, so making it making sense for 2040, 2050, and so on and so forth, forgetting the use of gas or coal or whatnot, and all the other shades, by the way. Regarding the Middle East, yes, there is a lot of interest for hydrogen because in the Middle East, it can be an hydrogen powerhouse because they have everything they need to produce hydrogen. They have gas, oil, sun, wind in amounts that it's ready to be produced. And indeed, we have the first shipment of ammonia to Japan from Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. The problem is that they have a lot of potential for blue hydrogen, which is an unproven technology because we are not going to have 100% capture rates. And if those who will invest in this technology now, they're facing the risk to have green hydrogen becoming cheaper and their governments requiring system like guarantees of origin, requiring a minimum amount of CO2 emissions per hydrogen, which the blue hydrogen may not meet. So they are risking to locking them in a technology that they will not see 2040, 2050.
And then, of course, there's the risks of stranded assets, which we're already potentially going to see from the fossil fuel industry with the energy transition. Financial Times Lex estimated up to $900 billion potential, of course, only potential so far. But it just adds to that narrative, doesn't it, of too much left behind.
If you, the fossil fuel industry face the challenges for a complete overhaul. They have to change whatever they have done if they want to remain in the energy sector. Of course, if the political environment will remain the one that it is now, we cannot predict the future. I will never predict that 10 years ago, I will never say that now I will be talking about the more fringy technologies that no one would ever look into it with such interest. I hope that this will remain for the next 30, 50 years. And I don't see why not. But of course, there is always the risk that this will not happen. The risk from the fossil industry that will impact us is that if they're going to create a system that can distribute only fossil fuel-based solutions or technologies to still use fossil fuels feedstock, we are going to have to be locked in with this technology for a long time, and we don't have that much time.
And what about from the industry? What level of interest do you see for green hydrogen as well as blue and grey from the industry players? Because obviously those stakeholders in the energy transition and more on the environmental, perhaps also more on the economic side, are pushing it. Governments are pushing it as well. But what about more traditional industrial players and energy players who, like you say, are already having to overhaul massively? If we just look at the shipping sector alone, IMO 2020 last year was a humongous change. Some argue the biggest change in a century for the shipping industry to adjust to. So they've already done that. Is there a sense of resistance from industry in give us a minute, give us some time to consolidate before we start bringing in new ideas, or is there full appetite?
I think that's the question for industry. So let's say that industry is not an homogeneous thing. We have thousands of players, thousands of producers, and everyone will follow a different agenda and they will have a different plan. Now we are seeing, in particular in Europe, cases where they are changing already their technology to be ready for the next 20 years, 30 years, for the next century. The TRIMET pilot, the hybrid pilots are all examples of technologies that were not needed, but they are testing them to be ready for the future. And they believe evidently that these technologies will become central. They want to have the know-how and sell it outside. So while other other players may be bandwagoning a little hydrogen, also because it's a technology that will not see the light at a commercial larger scale before the next decade, so they can wait instead of moving toward efficient solutions. However, you raise a very good point. If we keep asking them to have incremental changes, that we will never reach immediately that point of total decarbonization that we need. Because
and it's more expensive as well.
Exactly, it becomes more expensive, it takes more time, and we need to give them the time to amortize their investments, otherwise they will fall outside of the market. And instead, those who didn't invest in energy efficient solution will survive. And so this is one key message for policymakers, is that to identify solutions for overall technologies, not evolution, but revolution. And the other point is that we have to avoid the carbon leakage, of course. This was mentioned in Irina's recent report, A Guide to Policy, Green Hydrogen, A Guide to Policy Making. And we recognize that carbon leakage is a threat. If we put too much pressure to decarbonize one sector, but it's not a global commitment, we are going to see probably people moving where their requirements are lower. This is in particular true for commodities that are highly competitive, like steel. While for other sectors, we can play it a little smartly, like for shipping, because few stakeholders, few players are responsible for most of the emissions within the sector. So targeted interventions, helping them to decarbonize, would be maybe the best solution.
And arguably simpler as well than others. A recent GI table that we did last week for the Middle East, with some very good speakers as well, was saying that 70%, the results showed that 70% of survey respondents believe that the region, the Middle East, could be a global leader of a hydrogen economy by 2030. So considering everything that we've discussed today and that ticking clock, do you think that's viable?
I think it's viable. Again, I think that Saudi Arabia and the Arabic region in general holds the optimal resources to become an hydrogen powerhouse. However, if we look at the strategies around the world, everyone wants to be an exporter, few people want to be an importer. The exporters depends on their technologies that they have, the resources that they have. They want to be exporters of blue hydrogen, like Norway, Canada, or green hydrogen, like Australia, New Zealand, Chile. And as I said, the Arabic regions, all the potential for both shades of hydrogen, but only one, the green hydrogen shade, is the one that can solve the hard to decarbonize sectors partially. Because also, just want to say one thing that maybe I missed to say, within the hard to decarbonize sectors, hydrogen is not the only solution either. There are other solutions present, and we should not forget them. Electricity is still working, and we can still use it. Direct use of bioenergy is still an option, and so on and so forth.
Well, that loops back to how we started, really, saying about hydrogen has huge potential, but at the same time, it can't distract from, as you say, tangible, practical, scalable, tried and trusted solutions that we very much have already. Manuel, thank you so much for joining us. I think we all have a lot to chew on. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. And again, let's hope that hydrogen will actually become what is meant to be.
For all our sakes.
For all our sakes.